Good morning. Welcome to Channing Unitarian Universalist Church. We're glad you joined us for worship this day. Whoever you are, whatever your theological, spiritual, political, sexual, racial orientation, or gender identity, you, yes, you, are welcome to worship here and become a part of this community. Why I went to prison and what I learned there is today's topic. I just want to tell you a little personal story. Announcements. Are there any announcements? I will make the announcement of my Halloween service coming up next week. It's a big party after, so get ready to have some fun. Back to why I went to prison and what I learned there is today's topic. I don't talk about this much, but since you're my people, I'll talk to you about it. I had a brother, Mark, who years ago used to drink and get into a lot of trouble. And the longest stretch he did was 7 years at Walpole State Penitentiary. He didn't talk about it much, and when he did, he told me funny stories. And I really don't remember much because I was about 5 or 6 when this all went down. But I just want to mention it because when you listen today, remember that these people in prison are somebody's brother, somebody's sister, somebody's nephew, niece, what have you. And there's little brothers and sisters missing these people and loving them and wanting them back in their life. And anything we can do to alleviate suffering all over the world, I'm all for it. So let's pay attention to this program today. I'm going to turn it over for the lighting of the chalice. Thank you for indulging me.
Please stand as you are willing and able, and you'll find our words for lighting the chalice in our insert for the order of service. They are unique for this week. As we light the chalice, may our souls become its heart. We join our hearts to the one great flame of bright compassion, beloved community, and fervent justice. May we become lanterns to the world, lighting the way for all. And now please join me in reciting our affirmation. Love is the doctrine of this church, the quest for truth its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God. And now we will stay standing for our opening hymn, number 155, in the great hymnal, Circle Round for Freedom.
So I just want to introduce this one very quickly. If you look at the music, it's a little bit different than our other hymns. So the melody line is actually the middle clef. So instead of being the top line, it's the middle. We're going to run this once through in unison, and then we're going to do it in harmony if we can, but no pressure. Yeah, so from the beginning, I'm going to start right on the beginning, singing unison.
So at this time, we will join together as a community to celebrate our joys together and offer peace and community to those with concerns today. And I have an extra ooze up here if anyone, if we were short on copies. I accidentally left one up here and then grabbed another. So. Any joys or concerns to share today? Jude?
I love my new hair. It's a joy.
Yes. Your hair is a joy. I had one phone phoned in today a concern, well, it's phrased as a concern, but I think it's a joy too. Lauren's son Nate got his orders for a man. Everyone be careful out there. Surely agree. Couldn't do any worse. Vicky, how many did you bring home?
5.
5.
One cocker pumpkin and then 2 little ones. And of course, we're not so soon to home.
Okay. June?
My son is doing a bit better, and he should be coming home, I think, the end of the week.
That's wonderful to hear that your son is doing better. Susan?
I'd like to light a candle for my friend Shirley in Florida, who survived the hurricane, had some damage to the house, but she's okay. Not the house is okay, but she continues to struggle with physical and
For Shirley, for everyone down south from the past 2 hurricanes, and I'm sure all the existing issues that those storms have affected as well. Yes?
I've been in a little while, and it's a joy to be in this space.
Welcome back. Yes, Alex?
I'd like to light several hundred candles for the children who this service has put me in mind of, who I knew and cared for in the juvenile justice system. There was a lot of joy there and a lot of concern.
I've got a joy / concern. I'm gonna start dog sitting today. Fingers crossed. There may be a dog in church next week.
Well, whatever your dog's theological, spiritual. Julie?
The joy and concern for Doggy and Maggie, whose pet fish died on the weekend. But then we got some new pet shrimp.
I'm joy and concern. Life expectancy in our family away is a conflict. But back today, and life's been so full of joys and concerns, and very heavy with concerns. I'm just really happy to be here to help me process them and gain strength and help others do the same kind of week.
It's good to see you. Yeah. Lost friends. Yes, specifically for your friend, but also. And I will light one more for all those joys and concerns we carry with us. We may not be ready to share.
We just want to take a moment in remembrance and prayer, especially for all the inmates in our prisons throughout the country, throughout the world. Some of you may know I worked for over 20 years in the federal prison system. And if you haven't ever been to a prison, there's a wide range of security levels and a wide range of type of inmate depending on what security level you are in. Some of them have a lot of mental issues. Some of them have a lot of drug and alcohol issues. And some of them are very hardened criminals, but that's actually a very small portion of the population. Most of them are people like you and I who just got caught up in the wrong situation and made some bad choices. And so what I'd like to do is just take a moment of silence to just, for all of them and their families, just to help them. We ask to help them to have peace in their life and to accept what they have and what they can do with their life as best they can. Thank you.
You may remain seated as we take a moment to sing hymn number 123, Spirit of Life. Is now at this time, we will accept your donations to keep this congregation's many services moving and doing what we do best to help this community. So thank you, and take it away. please stand as you're willing and able for the dedication of gifts. Find the words in your insert to the order of service. Thank you. Please be seated.
You have to excuse me for a second. I forgot to print out the reading. That's my fault. So our reading is an excerpt provided from The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, correct? Okay. Solidarity is a radical posture. It means fighting at the side of the oppressed to transform the objective reality which has made them beings for another. One can be in solidarity with the oppressed only when one stops regarding them as an abstract category and sees them as persons who have been unjustly dealt with and deprived of their voice. When one stops making pious, sentimental, and individualistic gestures and risks an act of love. True solidarity is found only in the plenitude of this act of love. To affirm that men and women are persons, and as persons should be free, and yet do nothing tangible to make this affirmation a reality, is a farce. And now I will welcome up to our lectern, Dr. Kelly Brotzman.
Good morning. Thank you, everyone who's put this service together. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you this morning. Reverend Judy, who I think most of you know, is also a community minister at my church, which is First Parish Kingston. And she says such wonderful things about this community, and I know ministering here brings her a lot of joy. So thank you. Today I want to tell you about a journey I've been on for about the last 20 years. But first I should clarify that the title of this sermon, Why I Went to Prison, does not refer to any specific criminal history on my part. As far as I know, apart from a few parking tickets, I have a basically clean rap sheet. But I have spent a lot of time inside American prisons and working with and walking alongside incarcerated people. And I've done this on purpose and by choice. The time I've spent doing this could definitely have been spent on other pursuits that probably would have led to more professional recognition and advancement in my previous career in academia. But something powerful, irresistible even, draws me to prisons and to incarcerated people. And I realize this is odd to the average person. Don't get me at a cocktail party because I'll start talking about prisons or incarcerated people. The vast majority of Americans have never set foot inside a prison or jail and almost never think about the people inside of them. They don't have to. If or when the average person does think about prisons or the people inside them, they don't generally think of them as pleasant places to be, filled with lovely people. So what's so weird about me? Why do I find this mostly forgotten world so absorbing, so disquieting, and so highly charged with meaning and significance? To answer that question, I have to tell you a little about myself. I was raised deep in the heart of the moral majority. I was a 1980s kid in a highly observant evangelical Christian family and a career military family to boot. My father was in the United States Air Force for 26 years. So in my early world, sacred things included not just the Bible, but also the American flag, Ronald Reagan, every fertilized egg that ever swam around in anyone's uterus, and the writings of Dr. Dobson, Phyllis Schlafly, and that whole crew. Evil things included cults, communists, and relativism, whatever that was. So you get the picture. Now, I need to tell you that I had walked a fairly long way from this background by the time I first entered a prison in 2005, in my early 30s. Still, some things from your upbringing are hard to shake. And one moral touchstone that is still today very hard for me to shake is a rather vivid scene from Matthew 25 in the Christian New Testament. Somebody called the Son of Man sits on a glorious throne and separates all the people in the world into two groups. One group, the sheep, they get the good end of the deal. They get an inheritance and a kingdom prepared from eternity for them. And they get this not because of anything they did for the Son of Man per se, but because of what they did for the least of these. The outcast, the powerless, those on the margins. The sheep gave food to hungry people. They gave clothing to those without. They visited sick people, and they welcomed strangers. And they also conspicuously visited people in prison. Now, the other group, the goats, well, they didn't do any of these things. And the Son of Man gives the goats an eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Now, I'm pretty certain that the eternal fire was no more than the rhetorical flourish of an ancient writer. But when I first considered volunteering in a prison, at least part of my motivation was a version of the old child's game. Which one of these is not like the other? Look at the things the sheep do. Food to the hungry. Well, that's totally obvious. Absolutely no one deserves to go without adequate nourishment. And because of that conviction, I had done my fair share of food pantry shifts and canned food drives. Clothing to the naked. Ditto. Check. Visiting sick people. Ditto. Check. But visiting people in prison? Hadn't people in prison done bad and scary things to be in there? Unlike the hungry and the sick and so on. At any rate, I wanted to know why visiting people in prison was on this particular list. And the other part of my motivation was that around this time, it was becoming fairly clear to many Americans that our country had a little bit of a prison problem. I'm kidding. Actually, we had a massive, growing addiction to imprisonment as the default response to almost every single social problem, especially, as Mike mentioned, mental illness and addiction. Between the early 80s and the late 2000s, the number of people incarcerated in this country quintupled. And it was not random who wound up in prison. The poor and people from low-income communities and backgrounds were disproportionately subject to more policing and more criminal charges. And because they were less likely to be represented by lawyers in court proceedings, they were much more likely to get harsher sentences than affluent people with identical charges. And worst of all, I think most of us know, are the patterned and systematic racial disparities. White people make up 60 to 65% of the US population, but just 32% of the incarcerated population. By contrast, Black people are 12 to 13% of the US population, but 34% of the incarcerated population. Another way of saying this is that you are 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as a Black person than as a white person. And I should add that as someone with a PhD in social ethics, I was regularly teaching college classes about social injustice, inequality, poverty, and the like. So it was pretty obvious to me that there was no bigger example for my students to study than the American prison system. So I had these 2 motivations. I wanted to know why visiting people in prison was, morally speaking, just as important as feeding the hungry. And I had a growing concern, let's call it what it is, outrage, about the utter ridiculousness of the policy experiment my country had been pursuing for most of my lifetime. A policy experiment that I sometimes think is too tidily called mass incarceration. And I've always shared a conviction with one of my moral heroes, who is Bryan Stevenson. He's the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, and a crusading attorney and the author of the book Just Mercy, which inspired the film of the same name. Perhaps you've seen it. Stevenson says, and I wholeheartedly agree, that if you want to understand a problem, you must get proximate to the people affected by it. And by proximity, Stevenson means real, no kidding, personal nearness. So if I wanted to get my head around the realities of incarceration in contemporary America, I needed to find a way to be in relationship with people in prison. I needed to find ways to get to know them, interact with them, and connect with them. So I did, over the course of many years and in several different ways. I started out by visiting 2 people in Massachusetts prisons who were pursuing college degrees through what was then a trailblazing free bachelor's degree program offered by Boston University, the prison education program. I got to know my mentees pretty well, and both were successful in completing their college degrees, which is no small feat from inside a prison. And later, I spent several semesters teaching so-called inside-out courses, inside-out college courses, in a drab cinder block room at the end of the education hallway at a medium security state prison in Virginia. And inside-out courses are called what they are because they co-enroll equal numbers of incarcerated people and non-incarcerated regular college students. So let me tell you that taking a van load of largely affluent, white, preppy college kids into prison every day for class was quite the experience. I had a few phone calls from parents that were a little bit tough. These days, I have transitioned away from academia, and I have the privilege of serving as the executive director of Prison Book Program, which is a 52-year-old nonprofit based in Quincy Center that sends free books to any incarcerated person in the country upon request. In this role, I am literally awash in personal communications from people in prison. Most of the 20,000 or so book requests that we fulfill on an annual basis starts with a personal letter. And even when I'm not working, my hobby is to volunteer with the Emerson Prison Initiative, which has very much taken the place of the Boston University program at MCI Norfolk, and help the men there who are pursuing post-secondary education. It's been 19 years since I first stepped foot into an American prison, and it's always difficult for me to find adequate words to describe what I have seen there and what I have learned by going inside. So let me start with the empirical realities of everyday life for people in prison. First is the sheer size of the carceral state. It's enormous. Although we've seen modest declines from the high water mark in 2008, when 2.3 million people were locked up in this country, there are still 1.9 million people locked up. If you took all of those people together, they would form this nation's 5th largest city, just behind Houston. The second thing is that the 1990s tough on crime ethos is still very much alive inside American prisons and jails, even in places like Massachusetts. Punishment for punishment's sake is still the norm, and rehabilitative programs largely absent. A third observation is also hard to miss. The sentences are so incredibly long. Most jurisdictions, in the wake of several pieces of legislation from the 80s and 90s, bipartisan, by the way, largely around drugs and sentencing, adopted mandatory life sentences, often without the opportunity for parole for a broad swath of crimes. Others established mandatory minimum sentencing, removed judicial discretion, and abolished parole entirely. A lot of people in Massachusetts don't realize that in 35 states, there is no parole. It just doesn't exist. Short prison stays are more the exception than the rule. Another thing that's hard to miss is how financially lucrative incarceration can be for the plethora of private companies that provide contracted services to prison systems, such as healthcare, commissary services, telecommunications, and more. Another thing I've learned is that most correctional systems unfortunately persist in dramatically overusing both solitary confinement and lockdowns. This typically means 22 to 23 hours of in-cell time. And the reasons typically given for using solitary confinement are usually related to so-called inmate safety, despite the fact that we know that solitary confinement for any length of time creates psychosis and suicidality where none existed before. We also know that the rest of the civilized world considers solitary confinement torture. The reason usually given for lockdowns is short staffing, despite the fact that, again, we know that more out-of-cell time makes prisons safer, not more dangerous, requiring less staff, not more. And as a result of these two tactics, solitary confinement and lockdowns, prison life is often one of boredom and idleness, rather than organized activities that might foster pro-social attitudes and behaviors. Last observation. Of all the terrible things that incarceration does to a person, and there are too many to count, the most egregious, in my opinion, is the way that it systematically, by design, and on purpose, undermines and destroys any caring relationships that incarcerated people might have brought with them when they entered prison. Now, I don't know about you, but I need a whole squad of people who care about me just to get through my day. Incarceration snips the ties that connect people to their squads. Prisons, especially high-security ones, are generally located far from population centers, understandably, making in-person visits difficult and expensive. Phone calls are also expensive, although hallelujah, Massachusetts just made all calls, local and long distance, free. And where the phone calls aren't free, the cost is shouldered by loved ones who often don't have the extra income to spare. Many stop picking up the phone when it rings. God have mercy. If you have a loved one go to prison, and thank you so much to Jude for sharing about his brother, it will take absolutely everything you have to keep that relationship going. The result is that prisons are filled to the brim with some of the loneliest, most isolated people I have ever encountered. I once had a prison warden tell me that fewer than 10% of the men in his custody ever received a visit. And just 20%, including that 10%, had people that they talked to on the phone. The number of incarcerated people who write letters to Prison Book Program who say, I have no one left on the outside, is staggering, and it breaks my heart. Now, when they say that, they don't mean that everyone they knew in their pre-prison life has literally died. They just mean that no one on this side of the wall is still willing or able to do anything for them. So if I were to summarize what I've learned from nearly 2 decades of going inside, I can only say that the purpose of today's prison system, stated or unstated, is nothing more than endless degradation and exploitation. Imagine the most dehumanizing environment you can and know that it is worse than that. I'm convinced that the only social function performed by the carceral system today is to serve as a very large, very expensive garbage can into which society can throw live human beings to be rid of them. And this disposability is not lost on incarcerated people. One man who wrote to Prison Book Program recently channeled thousands of others when he said, I sometimes feel as if I have been thrown away. Every time I have ever driven away from an American prison, I feel like I should have a siren on my car and turn it on, declaring a moral emergency. There are live human beings in there. So for all these reasons, my prison experiences have been nothing short of soul-crushing. So why can't I give them up? If for nothing else, just for sheer self-care, self-preservation. Well, the reason is because these very same experiences have also, at the very same time, been life-giving and liberating in ways I could never have predicted. Paulo Freire, the author of our reading for today, was a pioneering Brazilian educator in the 1960s and 70s. He taught thousands of illiterate, landless, largely Afro-Brazilian peasants who were basically enslaved by the largely Euro-Brazilian plantation owners. He taught them to read and write. And the real point of his approach, summarized in his masterwork, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, was not actually literacy, but what he called critical agency. By and through teaching oppressed people to read and write, he taught them that they were agents, not just people whose lives were scripted for them by the powerful and the elites. By teaching them to read and write, he taught them to be actors who could both recognize and name the forces subjugating them, and also intervene in the world with organizing and resistance. And in this way, they could alter the course of history and become the protagonists of their own lives and of Brazilian society. According to Frey, it is not the privileged who liberate the oppressed through largesse or reform. Rather, it is the oppressed who liberate themselves, and in so doing, their oppressors. Being proximate to incarcerated people, being in solidarity with them, getting to know them, and yes, taking the risk of loving them, has liberated me from so many things. Most importantly, it has liberated me from common misconceptions about incarcerated people. As Jude and Mike said, while prisons are, in all the ways I have just described, inhumane as institutions, they also happen to be filled with complicated, interesting, and multifaceted human beings who simply cannot be reduced to a single act or crime. I have come to believe that the people inside these monstrous places are exactly like the people outside of them. Many, and probably most of them, have caused tremendous pain. Which of us hasn't done the same? Most of them also, in my experience, carry the marks of deep wounds inflicted on them by others, possibly with fists, belts, or guns, but also with sexual abuse, racism, educational apartheid, and other forms of exclusion. Many, and probably most of them, have special talents and skills. Which of us don't? As an example, one of the funniest human beings I have ever known is a man in prison. If he were a stand-up comedian and he were on this side of the wall, he would have a hit Netflix special immediately. The single best writer I ever taught as a college professor is an incarcerated man. I have a friend on the outside, a gentleman who played for 40 years what's called correspondence chess with incarcerated people. That's where you mail your moves on the board. You have a drawn board and you mail your moves back and forth. And he once said to me that one of his incarcerated chess buddies was probably grandmaster level. So in all of these ways, solidarity with incarcerated people has freed me from what the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls the danger of a single story. According to Adichie, in her viral TED Talk, telling one and only one story about any person or any group of people is the very heart of oppression and colonialism. Because every person and every place contains multitudes of stories, some of them contradictory. But that complexity is what makes us all human. In the public imagination, at least, incarcerated people are like creatures captured in amber, forever and always who they were when they went into prison. Criminals. But the reality is much more fluid, much more real. These criminals keep growing and keep evolving after their sentences are pronounced, just as all of us do on this side of the wall. Every incarcerated person I have ever known has many stories to tell, all of them equally valid. What their lives were like prior to prison, who they have become during the course of their incarceration, and much, much more. The most common question they're asked is about what they did to wind up in prison. But this story is just a small part of who they are. One of the main things that draws me to people in prison is the surprisingly large portion of them who have undertaken the difficult, slow, and courageous work of healing themselves. I have so many stories of people who have dedicated themselves to personal transformation, and I hold them in my heart every day. They use any resources they can to look within, to examine the pain they carry and the pain they have caused, to seek reconciliation and to become fundamentally new, different people. People who are responsible. People who contribute to the healing journeys of others. They do this, in my experience, not because of the prison system, but in spite of it. Their very humanity rises up, invites them to self-examination and to community, and drives them to self-improvement. And if this isn't a story of liberation, I don't know what is. Making yourself the narrator of your own complicated life, and using that narrative to help others along in their journey to self-understanding. Incarcerated people who go on these redemptive journeys liberate me because they show me how it is possible to transform, to be the protagonist of one's own story, and to ultimately triumph over the single story that gets told about them. They become new people against the strongest of headwinds. For all intents and purposes, they've been thrown away by their fellow citizens. But they remake themselves, keeping the little flame of their own dignity lit. For me, being connected to people like this has been ennobling. It has made me a better person and pushed me to do more for the cause of collective liberation. Let me share a short thank you letter that was sent to Prison Book Program late last year by Benjamin, who is incarcerated in Washington State. Benjamin writes, "I recently received a stack of books from your group, and I simply wanted to reach out and extend my gratitude, not only for the books you provided, but also for the work you do, the service you provide, and the consideration you seem to put into the selection process. The personal holiday that folks in my position feel when we get mail and communication is wonderful, but there's an added sprinkle of joy when it's from folks on the outside who don't know us, but care enough to give of their time, of themselves, to not only provide a service like this, but also to write encouraging notes." I should say that every package of books that we send at Prison Book Program comes with a personal note using the recipient's first name. "I maintain a journal of my personal experience of my incarceration, and I have written quite a few entries about my fears and concerns about rejoining society someday, and the concern of the social stigma of being a convicted felon and the difficulties it may present. The service you folks provide reminds me that there are people other than my family and friends, people who don't know me beyond the worst thing I've ever done, who may still choose to look at me and treat me like a human being, like a man who made a mistake. If you folks weren't aware of that impact that you have on people, I wanted to let you know. You make a difference in the lives of people who at times feel very broken." Thank you, Benjamin. So I think I have my answer about why the sheep visit people in prison, in addition to feeding the hungry. It's because incarcerated people, like others suffering from deprivation and oppression, have something to reveal, something to show all of us about what it means to be human, about what it means to be broken and yet whole, and about the journey toward wholeness we must all undertake in order to free ourselves from the single stories that dominate and cripple us. Thank you.
Kelly, do you have information about how we could do a book drive here? Okay. Do you want to present now or during coffee hour or? Okay, so we'll have more information about what we can do to help contribute to prison book program. In closing, after today's message and what we have learned and some of my own experience with the prison system, I have been incarcerated for a day, and I was there long enough that I actually was taken into the portion where they hold people for 1 to 5 years until I was able to be released. So I got a glimpse myself of what it's like for a mistake I made. It was a pretty big mistake. I can talk about it later if anyone wants to hear it, but yeah, I can tell you, it is interesting dragging your own bed for the night down a hallway while your ankles are shackled together for a nonviolent offense. We also, Julie and I, struggled to maintain contact with a friend of ours who was locked away for a year on a drug offense. And I can tell you, it is difficult. They make it hard. It is also expensive. We had to continue to maintain an expense account to receive collect calls. And his too, we had to maintain it on both ends. And not only does it, you lose the person for a year, but you can lose them for the rest of their lives. And so I ask all of you, as I continue to remind myself, to ask, what is prison for? What is the goal? Is it punishment? Is it rehabilitation? What do we hope for the outcome to be of that system? And if we look and see an outcome that we don't like, what can we each do to change that outcome? And to remember, as we sometimes, we see a person being locked away we don't particularly like, to take a moment before feeling, to indulging in Schadenfreude. Please stand as you're willing and able for the extinguishing of our chalice. The words can be found in your insert, the order of service. Oh, I'm sorry. It's like I'm a real minister. I skipped the closing hymn. Yes. It's number 108, My Life Flows On, an Endless Song.
Please keep standing as you're willing and able for the extinguishing of the chalice. The words can be found in your insert, in the order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Go in peace.